This is garbage. Cynthia dropped my 6-year-old daughter's handmade ornament into the trash. The Christmas gift exchange fell completely silent. My mother-in-law handed Isabella a cheap coloring book, then handed my 8-year-old son a $500 VR drone. At least Mason is actually blood, she announced to the room. We all know who fathered her. I didn't panic. The room turned to ice as Mason stepped in front of his sister. Have you ever been completely paralyzed by a toxic family member's cruelty? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The silence in the living room was absolute. Cynthia's words hung in the air, a toxic cloud suffocating the rest of us. Then came the sound, a sharp, violent crack of shattering plastic. Mason stood over the remnants of his $500 VR drone. He had raised his foot and driven his heel directly through the center console, crushing the expensive lenses and delicate hardware into a spiderweb of useless shards. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just looked his grandmother dead in the eye with a coldness that mirrored my own internal ice. If she's not your granddaughter, my 8-year-old son said, his voice terrifyingly steady, then I'm not your grandson. He reached out, tightly gripping Isabella's small, trembling hand. I stood there, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of Cynthia's insult. For years, I had been locked in a psychological freeze response. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. I call it the invisible chain of the survivor. When you endure 1,000 subtle digs, 1,000 passive-aggressive comments about your background, your parenting, and your worth, your brain learns to absorb the blows. You compartmentalize the abuse. You smile through clenched teeth to keep the peace, because fighting back feels like detonating a landmine in your own home. I had trained myself to swallow the poison, convincing myself I was doing it so my children wouldn't have to taste it. But seeing my 8-year-old son shatter that illusion, seeing him forcefully reject the very toxicity I had been conditioned to tolerate violently snapped that chain, his immediate, explosive defense was the catalyst for my own awakening. The paralysis evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, unfeeling clarity. The time for surviving was over. I braced myself for the inevitable fallout. I waited for Jordan, the eternal peacemaker, to step in and mitigate the damage, to apologize for our son's destruction of property, to try and bridge the sudden, gaping chasm in the middle of his mother's immaculate living room. But Jordan didn't shout. He didn't offer a single word of appeasement to his mother. He looked at the crushed plastic of the drone. He looked at Cynthia's shocked, aggressively painted face. Then he looked at me. The familial warmth was entirely gone from his eyes, replaced by a clinical, terrifying precision. Coats, he instructed softly. He didn't wait for a response. He methodically helped Isabella into her winter jacket, zipped it up to her chin, and ushered both children toward the front door. Cynthia finally found her voice, sputtering in a panicked, rising crescendo about disrespect and ungratefulness. We moved like ghosts. We simply stopped acknowledging her existence. She was no longer a mother-in-law. She was a neutralized threat. The walk to the driveway was executed in total, absolute silence. The crisp December air hit my face, sharp and sobering. Jordan buckled the kids into the back seat, closed the heavy car doors, and slid into the driver's seat. I sat beside him, watching his profile in the dark. He didn't start the engine. He didn't grip the steering wheel in anger or bang his fists in despair. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. His face was illuminated by the harsh white glow of the screen. He bypassed the ignition entirely, his thumb tapping steadily as he opened his banking app. The era of being the silent investors in their toxic version of family was over. The drive away from the estate was suffocatingly quiet. The only sound in the car was the rhythmic hum of the heater and the steady, deliberate tapping of Jordan's thumb against his glowing phone screen. He hadn't started the engine. He just sat there in the driver's seat, bathed in the harsh white light of his banking app. I leaned over slightly, my eyes tracking the numbers on the screen. For 9 years, Jordan had been siphoning $1,500 a month directly into Cynthia and Richard's joint account. It was an automated, invisible drain that had bled us of $162,000 over nearly a decade. Seeing the total laid out in black and white was a physical blow. The stark numbers instantly translated into a highlight reel of my sacrifices. I remembered the smell of thrift store detergent, spending hours digging through clearance bins for Mason's winter coats and Isabella's shoes. I remembered the low-level panic of checking price tags at the grocery store, constantly doing mental math to ensure we didn't overdraw our own account. Meanwhile, that invisible drain was funding Cynthia's reality. Our sacrificed comfort paid for her catered charity galas, the clinking of imported crystal, and the endless bailouts for Angela's perpetually failing boutique startups. We had been financing their delusion of superiority with the very money meant for our children's futures. I watched Jordan's face. There was no anger there, no sorrow, just a cold, sterile realization. For years, I had watched him compartmentalize this financial drain. His brain had meticulously labeled the bleeding of our accounts as filial duty. It was a textbook case of cognitive dissonance. To accept the reality of the extortion meant he would have to confront the monstrous nature of the people who raised him. So he built a psychological fortress, convincing himself that he was simply fulfilling his role as a dutiful son. It was easier to pay the monthly ransom than to accept that his parents viewed him not as a son, but as a revenue stream. But that fragile psychological illusion required total compliance. It required everyone to play their part. The moment Cynthia threw Isabella's handmade ornament into the trash and publicly declared my daughter a product of infidelity, the illusion violently shattered. The cognitive dissonance evaporated instantly. The label of filial duty was stripped away, exposing the raw, ugly truth of their parasitism. They hadn't just insulted our daughter, they had inadvertently severed the very psychological tether that kept their bank accounts full. Jordan didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for my input or offer a justification. He simply navigated to the recurring transfers menu. Tap. Cancel scheduled payment. Tap. Confirm cancellation. Tap. Delete saved account information. With 3 clinical unemotional movements of his thumb, $162,000 of historical financial abuse came to a permanent halt. He locked his phone, dropped it into the cup holder, and finally started the engine. We drove into the night, leaving the invisible chains shattered in the driveway. It took exactly 41 hours for the financial reality to hit Cynthia's curated world. I didn't receive a phone call demanding an explanation. I didn't get an apology for the Christmas massacre. Instead, she went nuclear on the only battleground she understood. My phone lit up on Tuesday morning with a notification from Facebook, followed immediately by an alert from TikTok. I opened the application and watched the performance of a lifetime. Cynthia sat in her immaculate living room, wearing a beige cashmere sweater specifically chosen to make her look fragile and maternal. The lighting was perfectly diffused. Her makeup was flawless, save for the strategic, glistening tear tracking down her cheek. In a trembling, carefully modulated voice, she announced to her thousands of local followers that her son had been completely brainwashed. She claimed that I was a manipulative gold digger who had orchestrated a hostile takeover of their family finances, effectively stealing the retirement fund she and Richard had worked their entire lives to build. But the financial lies were just the opening act. She looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes wide with manufactured heartbreak, and explicitly stated that my 6-year-old daughter was the product of an affair. She told the internet that her poor, blinded son was raising another man's child while I ruthlessly drained his accounts. I didn't throw my phone. I didn't break down in tears or scream at the sheer injustice of it all. I simply scrolled down to the comment section, analyzing the data of her smear campaign. Angela was the first to pin a comment. My sister-in-law, currently funding her lifestyle with the very money Jordan had just cut off, wrote a paragraph about how she had always seen through my disguise. Beneath her, Angela's teenage daughter, Madison, the undisputed golden child of the grandchildren, replied with a series of broken heart emojis, claiming she missed her Uncle Jordan. Within the hour, the algorithm caught the drama. The video gained massive traction. My phone began to vibrate with a steady, relentless rhythm. Messages flooded in from distant relatives, family, friends, and complete strangers. They called me a parasite. They called me a homewrecker. They demanded I return the stolen retirement funds to an elderly couple just trying to survive. I took screenshots of every comment, every threat, and every defamatory claim, cataloging them into a secure digital folder with the clinical detachment of an auditor reviewing a bankrupt company's ledgers. Jordan walked into the kitchen as I was archiving the digital evidence. I turned the screen toward him. He watched his mother's weeping performance from start to finish. His jaw didn't tighten. His breathing didn't change. He viewed the video not as a son watching his mother, but as a prosecutor reviewing Exhibit A. Cynthia had wanted to humiliate me. She wanted to force me into a defensive panic, expecting me to beg for a truce or publicly defend my character. She expected a messy, emotional reaction. Instead, she gave us exactly what we needed. By broadcasting her absolute lack of remorse and cementing her defamatory lies in the public domain, Cynthia effectively removed the last remaining barrier of familial obligation. She greenlit the retaliation. The warning shots were over. It was time to take the gloves off. We did not leave a single comment. We did not post a rebuttal video. Engaging with Cynthia's fabricated hysteria would only legitimize her delusion. Instead, Jordan and I transitioned immediately from silent observation to cold, professional warfare. Our response would not be measured in emotional appeals or internet sympathy. It would be measured in legally binding documentation. At 8 o'clock the next morning, we walked into a sterile clinical laboratory. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as we paid for a court-admissible chain of custody DNA test. There was no hesitation, no tearful conversation. As the technician swabbed the inside of Isabella's cheek, then Jordan's, we weren't doing this to satisfy Cynthia's malicious accusations. We were building an impenetrable fortress of empirical evidence. We were weaponizing the truth. Simultaneously, Jordan moved to sever the remaining financial arteries. He didn't just want to stop the bleeding. He wanted to cauterize the wound completely. By noon, he had retained a ruthless forensic accountant, a man who specialized in dissecting complex corporate fraud and hidden asset tracking. Jordan handed over 9 years of banking history, tax returns, and Social Security records. His instructions were explicit: find every account, every hidden tie, every single vulnerability, and eradicate them. We expected the accountant to find petty theft. We expected to uncover misallocated funds or hidden credit cards used for lavish dinners and designer clothes. We were completely unprepared for the lethal discovery he brought to us exactly 48 hours later. We sat in the accountant's mahogany-paneled office as he slid a thick, blue folder across the desk. Inside was a commercial lending agreement from a regional bank. The principal amount was staggering: $250,000. The purpose of the loan was listed as initial capital for Angela's luxury wellness boutique, the exact same boutique that had mysteriously folded after only 6 months of operation. But the criminal twist wasn't the failed business venture. It was the signature on the guarantor line. Cynthia and Richard had blatantly forged Jordan's signature as a silent corporate guarantor through a shell LLC. They had stolen his identity and leveraged his immaculate credit history to secure a massive private commercial loan for their golden daughter, deliberately structured so it wouldn't appear on his personal credit report unless it defaulted. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped into place. The $1,500 Jordan had been sending every month for 9 years was never an allowance to help his elderly parents. It wasn't a supplemental retirement fund. It was the exact amount of the minimum interest payment on the fraudulent loan. They had been extorting him to cover up their own felony. By clicking cancel in the driveway that night, Jordan hadn't just cut off their spending money. He had severed the lifeline to a massive, hidden liability. Without that monthly automated transfer, the minimum payment had bounced. The loan was instantly flagged by the lender. Jordan had inadvertently triggered a catastrophic commercial bank default, cementing his parents not just as toxic relatives, but as undeniable, documented criminals. The timer had officially started. It was only a matter of days before the bank initiated foreclosure and criminal fraud proceedings. We didn't need to destroy Cynthia's high society facade ourselves. We just needed to stand back and watch the implosion. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:14 p.m., 4 days after the automated transfer ceased. I didn't jump. I didn't feel a spike of anxiety. I simply checked the security camera feed on my phone. The high society facade had violently, entirely collapsed. Cynthia and Richard stood on our front porch. The arrogant polish that had defined their existence was entirely gone. Cynthia's meticulously curated appearance had disintegrated. Her mascara was smeared, and her hands were visibly shaking as she clutched her designer handbag like a flotation device. Richard stood slightly behind her, shoulders slumped, looking like a man who had just read his own financial obituary. Jordan opened the door. He didn't invite them in. He stood squarely in the threshold, an immovable barrier of cold finality. "Jordan, please," Cynthia started. her voice cracking in a desperate, breathy plea. The condescending matriarch had been replaced by a cornered liability. You have to turn the transfers back on. Just for this month? You don't understand what you've done? I understand perfectly, Jordan replied, his tone devoid of any familial warmth. It was the voice of an auditor identifying a discrepancy. The bank contacted us, Richard interjected, his voice trembling. They're auditing the commercial loan. Without that monthly minimum, they've flagged the account. They are threatening us with fraud charges, Jordan. Foreclosure on the estate. You have to fix this. They weren't apologizing for the Christmas massacre. They weren't apologizing for insulting their granddaughter. They were standing on our porch, begging the son they had financially exploited to save them from the legal consequences of their own felony. The power dynamic had completely and irrevocably flipped. Their perceived superiority had always been a fragile illusion, funded by the very people they deemed unworthy. I stepped forward, moving past Jordan to stand directly in front of the woman who had spent nearly a decade trying to erase me. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but clinical precision. I held out my hand. Between my fingers was a crisp, white, sealed envelope. "What is this?" Cynthia asked, her shaking hands reaching out to take it. "Empirical evidence," I stated, my voice ice cold. "It is a certified, legally binding clinical laboratory report. A 99.99% paternity match for Isabella." Cynthia stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. The last remaining shred of her manufactured reality had just been dismantled. "You have exactly 30 seconds to vacate our property," I told her, checking my watch with mechanical detachment. "If you are still standing on this porch at 31 seconds, I will contact the authorities. I will have you removed for trespassing, and I will personally hand the police the commercial lending agreement bearing Jordan's forged signature." Cynthia's mouth opened. A desperate sob caught in her throat, but the begging ceased. The realization hit them both simultaneously. We were no longer playing their game, and we held all the leverage. They had bankrupted their own authority. 20 seconds, I noted flatly. Richard grabbed Cynthia's arm, physically pulling her away from the door. They stumbled backward down the porch steps, retreating into the dark. Jordan didn't say another word. He simply reached out and slammed the door shut, locking the deadbolt with a sharp, definitive click. The weekend passed in a surreal, quiet calm. We didn't post a rebuttal. We didn't defend ourselves in the comment sections of Cynthia's video. When you hold a royal flush, you don't need to bluff. On Monday morning, Jordan's forensic accountant forwarded the forged documents to the district attorney's office and the commercial lender's fraud division. The gears of justice are usually slow, but massive corporate bank fraud is a remarkable accelerant. By Wednesday, the official notices of default and intent to foreclose were taped to the front door of their pristine estate. The bank froze all of Cynthia and Richard's assets, pending a criminal investigation. Desperation makes arrogant people incredibly sloppy. Instead of hiring a defense attorney and staying quiet, Cynthia decided to double down on her victim narrative. She believed her own lies so completely that she thought public opinion could somehow override federal law. She booked an interview on a popular local live stream podcast, begging for donations to a crowdfunding campaign to save their legacy. I watched the broadcast on my laptop. Jordan sat beside me. Cynthia was putting on a masterclass in manipulation, dabbing her eyes and talking about the cruelty of children. But the podcast host had done his research. Midway through her tearful monologue, he pulled up a public legal filing on his screen. "Cynthia," the host asked, his tone shifting, "we have a public civil lawsuit filed at the county courthouse this morning by the commercial lender. It includes an emergency commercial lien and explicitly alleges you and your husband forged Jordan's signature to secure a $250,000 loan. Is that why the bank is foreclosing?" The color drained from Cynthia's face. The live chat, which had been full of sympathy, froze. And then the mask slipped. Cornered and humiliated on a live 2026 broadcast, Cynthia lost her meticulously crafted composure. "We didn't forge anything," she shrieked, her voice shrill and unhinged. "We gave him life. We raised him. He owed us that money for Angela's business. It was his duty as a son to provide for this family." She didn't realize it, but she had just broadcast a full, uncoerced confession to financial extortion and fraud to thousands of viewers. The clip was saved, shared, and went viral within minutes. It was a digital wildfire of karmic justice. It was a textbook demonstration of the illusion of an empty wallet. For decades, Cynthia and Richard's entire social standing was just a leased facade, a hollow shell rented with stolen money. When the money vanished, there was no internal character, no genuine morality to hold them up. They collapsed instantly. The following weeks were a blur of absolute legal destruction. Richard was arrested on Thursday. Cynthia followed on Friday. Angela, terrified of being implicated as an accessory, publicly disowned her parents and fled the state, leaving them completely isolated. We didn't gloat. We didn't celebrate their downfall. We simply finalized our own boundaries. Jordan legally severed all remaining familial ties. We took the money we had saved from the canceled transfers and started a college trust fund for Isabella. The true victory wasn't watching them fall. It was knowing that the cycle of financial abuse and toxic manipulation had been permanently broken. We hadn't just survived the fire, we had used the ashes to plant a seed for a new, healthy future.